Afia sat across from Gelani at the dinner table, the pen in front of her. It wasn't a pen anyone would notice at first. Simple, almost elegant in its quiet way. Gelani had slid it toward her with the kind of cold authority that comes from being utterly sure of yourself. He looked at her with eyes that no longer saw her as his equal. They saw her as something to be controlled. "Write it," Gelani said, his voice smooth and calm, but there was an edge of something darker in it, something he hadn't even realized was there. His tone was the same as it always had been when he asked her to do something, like he was giving a command to someone who had already decided what was best for her. The table was silent. His mother, Miss Loretta, sat at the head of the table, her hands folded neatly in front of her, watching with a knowing look. She was the kind of woman who always seemed to know what was happening before it actually did. Gelani's aunt sat beside her, barely glancing up from her phone, yet the quiet tension in the room was palpable. Aunts and cousins in the room didn't dare speak, their eyes on the table, not on the spectacle unfolding before them. Afia took a deep breath. Her hands were steady as she reached out and grabbed the pen, the cool metal cold against her fingertips. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was about to write an apology letter to a woman who had no business being in her life. A woman who was a mere shadow compared to what Afia had quietly built over the years. But here she was, sitting in a chair too far from her husband's side, at the edge of the family table, being humiliated in front of his mother, his brother, and the mistress that had quietly wormed her way into their lives. The woman, Nadia, was sitting beside Gelani now, too close for comfort. Their elbows brushed every so often, their shared laughter louder than the rest of the room. Nadia's presence, so casual and confident, made Afia's stomach tighten, but she didn't react. Not yet. That's what she had learned over the years. Don't react. Don't show them what they're making you feel. The dinner moved on in the way it always did, with Gelani and Nadia at the center, spinning their little world without a care for anyone else. Afia's presence was ignored, as it had been for the past few months, ever since she'd started to notice the subtle shifts in Gelani. He had begun treating her differently, like she was someone who had ceased to matter. As the evening wore on, her mind drifted, replaying the events that had led to this moment. The small things that no one else saw. The way Gelani's gaze lingered too long on Nadia, the late-night phone calls that Afia knew were more than just business, and the coldness in his touch. But none of that mattered now. It had already been decided. Gelani was going to make her write an apology letter to the woman who had taken his affections. He hadn't even tried to hide it anymore. There was no pretense of protecting Afia's dignity. In fact, he had invited Nadia here to the dinner just to humiliate her. Afia swallowed the anger rising in her chest and focused on the task at hand. Her hand moved across the page, steady, slow, careful. She wrote the words, one letter after another. Not for Nadia, not for Gelani, but for herself. She wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. Not now. Not ever. The others around the table didn't say a word as she finished the letter. She folded it, the crisp paper barely making a sound, and then reached into her purse, pulling out a plain white envelope. She slid the letter inside, sealed it, and placed it in front of Gelani, not Nadia. Her heart was calm, her face unreadable. She didn't look at anyone. She didn't need to. She had already moved beyond them, beyond the facade of what they wanted her to be. Afia had learned from a young age that silence was the most powerful language in the room. It was the language her grandmother, Nana Celeste, had taught her, the language of control. The woman who controls her own silence controls everything. Gelani stared at the envelope for a long moment, his hand hovering over it. Nadia glanced at him, then at the envelope, a frown tugging at her lips, but she didn't say anything. No one did. Miss Loretta's expression didn't shift. She'd seen this all before. She'd known the outcome long before this night. Finally, Gelani reached for the envelope, his fingers trembling just slightly as he opened it. Inside, he found not an apology, but a legal notice. Afia's full name was listed at the top, Afia Turner. Beneath it, the notice outlined the dissolution of all their shared financial assets. All joint accounts were closed. All properties that Gelani thought they shared were now under her name alone. There was a clause at the end that formally removed Gelani from any involvement in her company's holdings. He had no claim to her $32 billion. I wrote what I felt. The note beneath the legal documents read in Afia's careful handwriting. Just like Nana Celeste taught me. Afia didn't need to say more. The room went dead silent. Gelani's face went pale. Nadia, ever the opportunist, reached for his hand, but it didn't bring him comfort. It only deepened the pit in his stomach. He could feel the weight of everything he had taken for granted crashing down on him. The investments he thought were his. The empire he had tried to build on the back of a woman he had disregarded. Miss Loretta sat still, the look of a woman who had just been struck with the coldest truth she had ever experienced. Afia, the woman she had dismissed, the one she had not understood, was the one who had quietly made it all possible. The money, the business, everything. And now, it was time for her to reclaim it. Gelani's business had been built on shaky ground, and Afia had known that. He had no idea that the assets he thought were his had been carefully pried away from his control, until now. The truth had come, and it was undeniable. Gelani sat in the plush leather chair of his downtown office, staring blankly at the city skyline. The lights of the city glittered outside the window, an illusion of stability and wealth. It should have been a symbol of success, but now it felt like a mockery. His empire was crumbling around him, and he didn't even understand how it had happened. The meeting with the bank had been the final blow. The accounts he had worked so hard to build, the properties, the investments, all of it was gone. Every asset that he had shared with Afia had been quietly siphoned off, reorganized, and placed firmly out of his reach. His name, once proudly attached to everything, now meant nothing. "You'll be receiving a formal notice in the mail," the banker had said, his voice cold and businesslike. "Your account will be closed by the end of the month. All transactions are frozen." Gelani's mouth went dry. He couldn't process the words. How had this happened? How had Afia managed to do all of this behind his back without him knowing? But he didn't have time to think about that now. He had a meeting with Nadia at 3 p.m., and he was sure she could see the panic written all over his face. She had been quiet lately, distant in a way that felt like she was waiting for something. He couldn't afford to lose her now, not when he had nothing left. He stood up abruptly, walking across the room to the sleek glass table where he kept his latest real estate contracts. His hands shook as he picked up the papers, but he quickly smoothed them out, pretending that he was still the man in control. But he wasn't. Not anymore. The elevator ride down to the lobby felt like an eternity. Every floor that passed made him more anxious, more aware of the quiet collapse that had taken place beneath his feet. He had been so certain, so confident in his position. He had everything: wealth, power, and Nadia. But now, as he stepped out of the elevator and into the crowded street, he realized he had nothing. The facade had cracked wide open, and all he could do was watch it crumble. Afia stood in her office, reviewing the final documents. The dissolution had been quiet and precise, just like everything she did. She had been methodical, calculating, and ruthless when it mattered. The $32 billion was now hers, fully. It was a silent victory, one that no one would see coming. Not Gelani, not his family, and certainly not Nadia. But it wasn't just about the money. That was the easy part. Afia's real goal was something more satisfying, something deeper. Control. She was no longer the woman who stood silently on the outskirts, watching as her husband manipulated his way into wealth and success. She had been underestimated, dismissed, treated like an afterthought. But now, with every document, every deal, she had taken back what was rightfully hers. And the world was about to see who she truly was. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. She glanced at the screen. It was from Mr. Okafor, her trusted attorney. Afia, the message read, I've received word from the bank. They're moving ahead with the legal dissolution. Gelani has no idea what's coming next. Afia smiled to herself. She had known this moment would come. Gelani was always so confident, so arrogant, that he never saw her quiet work behind the scenes. She had spent years building an empire in silence, letting him think he was the one making the moves. But now, it was time for her to take center stage. Her fingers hovered over her phone screen, drafting a quick reply to Mr. Okafor. Good. Prepare the next phase. We're going to make sure Gelani never sees it coming. She sent the message and set the phone down. There was something coldly satisfying about how effortlessly she had dismantled everything Gelani had worked for. And yet, it wasn't just about his downfall. It was about her rise. The next few weeks would be crucial. The Legacy Gala was coming up, and she had already planned her entrance. She would stand in front of the very people who had doubted her, the people who had overlooked her contributions, and she would claim her place. Afia wasn't just building wealth. She was building something indestructible. The only thing Gelani had left was a paper trail of mistakes, and soon enough, the world would see them all. Back at Gelani's office, the walls seemed to close in around him. He sat in the same chair, but this time it felt different. The luxury, the comfort, the security, it all felt empty. The silence was suffocating. He reached for his phone, dialing Nadia's number. Nadia, we need to talk, he said when she picked up. What's wrong? She asked, her voice laced with concern. It's all falling apart, Gelani admitted. I don't know how she did it, but Afia, she's taken everything. My business, my assets. I'm on the edge here, Nadia. I need you to be with me. For a moment, there was silence on the other end. Nadia didn't speak. Gelani's heart raced. Nadia, he said, panic creeping into his voice. And then she spoke. Gelani, Nadia's voice was cold, and for the first time, it didn't sound like the woman who had been so supportive. You need to face the truth. Afia has been ahead of you this whole time. She always has been. And now you've lost. I'm sorry, but I can't do this anymore. Gelani felt the world spin around him. His vision blurred. She was leaving him. Nadia, the one person who had been his rock, had already calculated her exit. He knew then that he had nothing left. He hung up the phone without saying another word. He couldn't process the loss. He had lost everything. Afia, the company, and now Nadia. All because of his arrogance, his need to control everything and everyone around him. The power he thought he had was nothing more than a house of cards, and it had just collapsed. Afia, meanwhile, was at home, watching the rain fall gently outside her window. She had already begun to plan the next steps. Gelani would be exposed in front of the world at the Legacy Gala. The truth of his betrayal, his arrogance, and his underestimation of her would come to light. But what truly satisfied her wasn't the fall of Gelani or the money. It was the quiet, methodical nature of her revenge. She had built it all in silence, and now it was time for the world to finally hear her story. Afia had never needed to shout. She didn't need the attention, the drama, or the noise. She had built her empire quietly, patiently, and when the time was right, she would let it speak for itself. Gelani stood at the window of his penthouse, staring out over the city that had once felt like it belonged to him. The lights twinkled below, a far-off dream that felt distant, almost unreal. He had built his empire with sweat and ambition, thinking he was untouchable. Now he was watching it slip through his fingers. The phone call from his attorney had been the final blow. I don't know what to tell you, Gelani, the lawyer had said, his voice tight. Your name has been removed from all your company holdings. Afia has taken everything, even the properties you thought were safe. I'm sorry, but there's nothing we can do. Gelani had paced the room, his mind racing. Afia, the quiet woman he had underestimated, the woman he had dismissed, had outsmarted him at every turn. She had played him like a puppet, and now she had all the strings. He reached for his phone, dialing Nadia's number for the third time that day. The call went to voicemail. He didn't leave a message. She was done with him. He thought about the gala. The Legacy Gala. It was only days away, and the event that was supposed to honor him, his greatest achievement, was about to become the moment his life fell apart. Afia had planned it all. She had woven the threads of his destruction so carefully, so quietly, that he hadn't even noticed the noose tightening around his neck. Afia sat in the quiet of her office, reviewing the final documents for the gala. She had spent years building this moment. Every detail, every move, every decision had been part of the plan. Now it was time. She wasn't just taking control of her life, she was taking control of the narrative. The world was going to see exactly what she had built. They were going to see her for who she truly was. Her phone buzzed with a message from Mr. Okafor, her trusted attorney. Afia, everything is set for the gala. Your presence will be the final reveal. Gelani has no idea what's coming. Afia smiled to herself. Gelani thought he still had power. He didn't. Good. Prepare the media for the exposure. Make sure they know who really built this empire. She replied before setting the phone down. Her fingers lingered over the laptop, reviewing the press release for the gala. She wasn't just a businesswoman. She was the woman who had been quietly building an empire for years, without anyone noticing. And now, at the Legacy Gala, she would finally reveal the truth. The truth that Gelani had never even known the full extent of her wealth. $32 billion. And that number wasn't just a symbol of her financial success. It was a symbol of the power he had never understood. The power of a woman who had spent years building in silence, letting her actions speak louder than words. At the same time, Gelani sat in the back of his car, watching the city pass by. He had been through too much to just let it go. He knew something had to be done. I'll fix this, he muttered to himself, his jaw clenched. I'll fix everything. But the truth was, he had no idea how. The walls were closing in on him, and the more he tried to control the situation, the more it slipped from his grasp. Nadia was gone. Afia was taking everything he had built, and he couldn't stop her. He wasn't even sure if he wanted to anymore. The more he thought about it, the more he realized how much he had taken her for granted. The way he had treated her. The way he had pushed her out of his life, thinking she was weak because she didn't fight like the other women he had known. Afia wasn't like anyone he had ever met. She wasn't loud. She didn't need to be. She had built an empire quietly, methodically, and now he was watching it all crumble. I'm sorry, Afia, he whispered, not sure if anyone could hear him, not sure if it mattered anymore. The night of the Legacy Gala arrived, and the room was buzzing with excitement. The elite of the city had gathered to celebrate their achievements, and Gelani was at the center of it all, his charm and confidence on full display. He wore his usual smile, but beneath it, the tension was palpable. He was a man on the edge, and he knew it. The award ceremony was running smoothly, with each honoree stepping up to the stage to accept their accolades. Gelani sat at the front of the room, his heart pounding in his chest. He was waiting for his moment, the moment when the world would recognize his success. But something was off. There was a shift in the air, a quiet tension that Gelani couldn't explain. And then, the MC's voice filled the room. Ladies and gentlemen, it is now time to honor the founding partner of the gala's 10-year legacy fund. Gelani sat up straighter. His stomach churned. He had no idea what was coming. The lights dimmed as a video played on the screen behind the MC, showing the silent hand that had built the foundation for everything. The real estate holdings, the energy contracts, the community grants, and the $32 billion. It was all there, laid bare for everyone to see. And then, the name appeared on the screen. Afia Turner. The room went quiet. Gelani's face drained of color. Nadia, who had been sitting beside him, froze. Miss Loretta, his mother, looked around the room in shock, her hand frozen on her glass. Afia stood at the back of the room, her presence commanding attention. She had entered the room quietly, dressed in a deep burgundy dress that didn't scream for attention, but demanded it nonetheless. Her hair was natural and full, a reflection of the woman who had built everything in silence. She walked to the stage with the same unhurried pace that had defined her entire life. And as she stood at the podium, facing the crowd, Gelani knew everything had changed. "Thank you," Afia said softly, her voice calm but filled with purpose. "It's an honor to be recognized tonight. But I want to share something more than just my accomplishments. I want to share the truth. The truth that this foundation, this gala, this city, all of it, has been built on the work of people who never asked for recognition. And that includes the silent, powerful women who built their empires without anyone noticing." Gelani's world tilted as he sat in his seat, staring at the woman who had quietly taken everything from him. She was no longer the woman he could control. She was the woman who had quietly, methodically, and patiently destroyed him. The applause from the gala was deafening, but Gelani felt like he was trapped in a vacuum. The clapping was distant, muffled, as if the room around him no longer existed. His body remained frozen in his seat, his hands gripping the edges of his chair. The reality of what had just happened was sinking in, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Afia stood at the podium, a picture of grace and power, the spotlight illuminating her presence in a way that made every other person in the room seem insignificant. She was the one they were all looking at now, not him. Her name was now synonymous with everything that had built this empire. Afia, the MC had called her name, but it wasn't just a name anymore. It was a declaration of something much bigger than Gelani had ever imagined. She was the quiet hand behind every deal, every investment, every foundation. And she had waited, patiently. She had built all of this in silence while he played his petty games with Nadia and ignored the woman who had been his equal and more. He had taken her for granted, and now she was showing the world exactly what she was capable of. Jelani's fingers tightened around the chair. His mind raced through the events of the night, trying to piece together how it had all gone wrong. How had he missed it? He had always thought Afia was just the quiet one, the one who didn't speak up, didn't ask for attention. But she had been building something far greater than he could ever understand. His thoughts were interrupted by a soft tap on his shoulder. Nadia. Her voice was low, almost careful as she leaned in. "What the hell just happened?" she whispered. Gelani couldn't answer. He just stared at the stage, at Afia, whose words were now echoing in his mind. He had spent years believing that he could control everything, manipulate the situation to his benefit. But now he saw the truth. Afia wasn't the woman he had tried to control. She had always been the one in control, and now she was exposing him for everything he was. Meanwhile, Afia was speaking calmly, confidently, her voice carrying through the room. "The truth," she said, "is that there is always more beneath the surface. Gelani and I built something together, but he did not build it with the same intention I did. He built it on borrowed time, on promises he never kept. But I built it from the ground up. And tonight, you will all see the truth." She paused for a moment, allowing the weight of her words to sink in. The room had grown silent, each person waiting for the next revelation. Afia took a deep breath, letting the tension build before continuing. "The truth is that I've always been here, always building, always working. And now, I'm here to claim what is mine." The room was still. Jelani's mind was spinning. Afia had taken everything from him, and the worst part was, he knew he had no one to blame but himself. He had been too arrogant, too sure of his place in the world to see how she had silently worked in the background, gathering the power he never thought she would take. The next few days passed in a blur for Gelani. He didn't know what to do with himself. His business was falling apart, his reputation was in tatters, and Afia was everywhere. The media was covering her every move, her $32 billion empire becoming the headline of every news outlet. He had tried to salvage his business, reaching out to his investors, his colleagues. But every time he made a call, the response was the same. They were pulling out. They didn't want to be associated with him anymore. They had seen the truth, and now he was a liability. Gelani had never felt so powerless in his life. He was used to controlling the room, to being the one who made the decisions. But now, he was just a man watching everything he had built collapse. Afia, on the other hand, was in full control. She had already begun the process of separating herself from Gelani's failing empire. The legal documents were in place. The companies she had built over the years were now officially under her name. She had no interest in the drama Gelani was facing. She was already moving forward, focusing on expanding her holdings even further. She had already made the calls. New partnerships, new opportunities were lining up. She was unstoppable now. But it wasn't just about the money. It was about the satisfaction of quietly dismantling everything Gelani had worked for, showing him and the world that the true power had always been with her. The day of the final public reveal came quickly. The gala was over, but Afia wasn't done. She had planned one final act of justice. She stood in front of a new audience now, business leaders, media moguls, and investors who had come to see the next phase of her empire. The press had gathered to document the unveiling of her newest business venture. Gelani had no idea what was about to happen. He thought he still had some control, some influence. But Afia was about to cut him off completely. The press release went out, the cameras flashed, and for the first time, Gelani realized he had lost everything. Not just his wealth, but his pride, his reputation, and his place in the world. As the event progressed, Gelani stood on the edge of the room, watching Afia as she spoke. The woman he had once loved, the woman he had once controlled, was now the one in control. She had silenced him, taken everything, and now the world was watching as she revealed her full power. The following week felt like a fog to Gelani. He could barely recall the details of the days that passed since Afia's final revelation at the gala. The world had shifted beneath him in ways he couldn't understand. His calls went unanswered. His meetings were either canceled or avoided. Even his closest allies, the ones he had once trusted to protect him, had turned their backs. And then came the final blow. He sat in his office, alone, staring at the screen of his computer. The stock prices of his businesses had plummeted. The investors had pulled out, and the public was already shifting their focus to Afia. She was everywhere, on every business channel, in the headlines, and now, even in the political scene. She had solidified her place as a power broker. The silence that had once been his shield now felt like a curse, for it was Afia's silence that had done the most damage. He looked down at the document on his desk. It was the final settlement agreement from his lawyer, no more access to their assets. Afia had legally severed all ties. The businesses, the property, everything had been quietly stripped away from his control. Gelani was no longer a partner in anything that mattered. He had been erased. But even that wasn't the hardest pill to swallow. The hardest pill to swallow was that he had let it happen. For the first time, Gelani faced the brutal truth. Afia had always been the silent architect of their success. He had been the one living in the illusion that he controlled everything, and Afia had patiently, methodically, outmaneuvered him. Afia, however, was not dwelling in the past. She stood on the balcony of her penthouse, looking out over the city she had built. Her empire, quiet, undeniable, and now unassailable, was hers. The phone buzzed in her hand, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from Mr. Okafor. The media campaign had officially launched, and every major outlet was now reporting on her success and the $32 billion fortune she had accumulated. But it wasn't just about the money. It was about control, about reclaiming her place in the world, about proving that no one, not even her own husband, could take from her what she had quietly earned. She had spent years building, knowing that someday she would reveal herself to the world. She had been underestimated, ignored, and dismissed, but now the world had no choice but to acknowledge her power. Afia responded to the message with a simple note. Let the world see what's coming. We're ready. Gelani's world continued to unravel. His calls to his investors were ignored. His once promising business ventures were now rotting. He no longer had access to the funds that had once flowed freely into his accounts. And worst of all, he couldn't escape the guilt. The guilt that he had let Afia slip through his fingers. The guilt that he had allowed his arrogance to drive him to a place where he couldn't even see the damage he was causing to the one person who had ever truly loved him. Nadia, the woman who had been his affair, had disappeared as quickly as she had entered his life. There were no messages, no explanations, no reason for her sudden absence. The truth of what had happened between them was now as meaningless as his business empire. She had seen him for what he was, weak, insecure, and incapable of understanding the woman who had built the world he lived in. The final court date arrived unexpectedly. The settlement hearings were about to be finalized, and for the first time since the dissolution, Gelani was forced to face Afia, not as his wife, but as the woman who had brought him to his knees. Gelani entered the courtroom, his shoulders heavy with the weight of everything he had lost. His lawyer stood beside him, whispering a few words of comfort that Gelani barely heard. His mind was focused on one thing, Afia. When she entered, the room seemed to shrink. Her presence filled the space, not with loud demands or fiery accusations, but with a quiet confidence that rattled him to his core. She was dressed simply, her black dress flowing around her like it belonged to her, like she belonged in this moment, in this place. The woman who had been so quiet, so invisible, was now a force that commanded attention. Afia sat across from him, her eyes steady and calm. The silence between them was thick, and it was Gelani who felt the weight of it more than anyone. She had nothing left to prove. She had already won. As the settlement papers were signed, Afia's lawyer passed them to Gelani's side of the table. The finality of it hit him like a punch in the stomach. Everything was now officially over. Afia didn't look at him. She didn't need to. She had done more than just secure her fortune. She had taken control of her life, her business, and her dignity. He had nothing left. The financial empire he thought he had built was now entirely hers. The one thing he hadn't counted on, the silence, had been the most powerful weapon in her arsenal. In the weeks that followed, the public attention shifted from Gelani to Afia's growing empire. The media couldn't get enough of her. She was everywhere, on business channels, on the covers of magazines, the subject of endless interviews and articles. Afia's empire had officially become the story. Her wealth and influence were undeniable, and Gelani, now a shadow of the man he used to be, faded from public view. No one cared about him anymore. They cared about her. One evening, Afia stood on the balcony of her penthouse again, looking out over the city. The lights below were bright, the air cool, and for the first time in years, she felt an overwhelming sense of peace. She had done it. She had built something that no one could ever take from her, and now, it was time for her to live her life on her terms. Afia turned away from the balcony and walked back inside, her steps echoing softly on the hardwood floors. There were still deals to make, still projects to oversee, but for the first time, it wasn't about surviving. It was about thriving. The woman who had once been invisible, the woman who had quietly endured betrayal and humiliation, was now the most powerful woman in the room, and no one would ever underestimate her again. The final days of Gelani's empire passed in a blur. He moved through his penthouse like a ghost, surrounded by the remnants of a life that had once been full of promise. The plush furniture, the carefully curated art on the walls, the luxurious view of the city, none of it mattered anymore. None of it could fill the emptiness he felt inside. His phone had stopped ringing. Investors who had once sought him out were now avoiding his calls. He had tried to salvage what was left, but his attempts were futile. Even his closest allies had turned their backs, one by one. And then, one morning, he found the letter waiting for him on his desk. Gelani. It began, the words stark against the polished paper. This is a formal notice that all remaining holdings, properties, and accounts previously connected to you have now been restructured and transferred to a separate entity. You are no longer a stakeholder in any of the companies associated with you. Your access to all financial accounts has been permanently revoked. It was from Afia's lawyer, Mr. Okafor, and it was the final confirmation of something Gelani already knew in his gut. Afia had taken everything. She had broken him down, not with force or loud demands, but with quiet precision, using every moment of weakness he had shown to her advantage. He sat there, staring at the letter, trying to comprehend the finality of it all. The legal jargon blurred in front of his eyes. He had lost it all: the wealth, the power, the status he had once clung to. But it wasn't just the loss of money. It was the loss of his identity. Afia had not only taken his business, she had taken the very foundation of who he was. And now, there was nothing left for him to stand on. Afia, on the other hand, was sitting in her office, her gaze fixed on the city below. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm golden light across the skyline. Everything she had worked for was in her hands now, and yet there was no celebration, no grand victory dance. She had already won, silently, methodically, and with a sense of peace she had never felt before. The power reversal had been complete, and Gelani had learned his lesson in the most painful way possible. Afia picked up the phone, dialing Mr. Okapor's number. She was no longer the woman who had been silenced. She had taken control of everything, and now it was time to move forward. "Make sure everything is finalized," she said when he picked up. "There's nothing left for me in this city. I'm moving on to bigger things." Mr. Okapor's voice came through the phone, calm and professional. "Understood, Afia. You've made all the right moves. The next chapter is yours." She hung up the phone and leaned back in her chair, letting out a deep breath. The weight of the past few months had lifted. It was no longer about revenge or getting back at Gelani. It was about her own journey, her own path, free from the shackles of a man who had never understood her worth. She had built this empire on her terms, and now it was time to expand. To move beyond the confines of the life she had once lived with Gelani. Gelani, meanwhile, had reached the end of his rope. He sat in his empty office, a glass of scotch in his hand, staring out at the city through the large window. He had once been at the top, but now he was just another man who had been destroyed by his own arrogance. The silence in the room was deafening. The thought of Afia's quiet revenge kept gnawing at him. She had outlasted him. She had outsmarted him at every turn. And what made it worse was the realization that she had never been the one to lash out. It was his own decisions, his own ego, that had led to this downfall. He had been too proud to listen, too proud to see the truth. He had always believed that his loud personality and charismatic charm would carry him through. But Afia had never needed to be loud. She had never needed to fight for attention. She had quietly built something unshakable, and now it was time for Gelani to face the consequences. The final moment of realization hit him like a truck. He had lost everything: his wealth, his reputation, and most importantly, the woman he had taken for granted. He had tried to break her, to push her out of his life, but in the end, it was he who had been broken. The Legacy Gala may have been over, but the legacy of Afia's victory was just beginning. The world was taking notice. She had reclaimed her rightful place. Her business was thriving. Her wealth was undeniable. And now, she was moving on to conquer the next frontier. Afia was no longer just the quiet wife in the background. She was the woman who had built everything from the ground up. The $32 billion empire was hers, but that number was just the beginning. Her plans extended far beyond the borders of her company, and she wasn't about to stop now. The world hadn't seen anything yet. Gelani sat alone in his penthouse, staring at his reflection in the dark window. The city outside was a blur of lights, but it all felt distant, far away. He was no longer part of it. He had been written out of his own story. His phone buzzed, breaking the silence. He reached for it, half expecting it to be another call from an angry investor or a creditor. But instead, it was a message from Nadia, the woman who had once been his lifeline. "I'm sorry, Gelani," It read, "I've moved on. I can't keep living in your shadow. You've lost everything, and I don't want to be part of it. I wish you the best, but I can't stay." Gelani stared at the message, the final piece of his destruction falling into place. Nadia had abandoned him, and now Afia, his once quiet wife, had taken everything. The weight of his humiliation was finally clear. The power reversal was complete. He had been the arrogant one, the one who thought he was untouchable. But in the end, it was Afia who had remained steady, silent, unshakable.